The sound of cracking ice echoed through the frozen Montana wilderness like a gunshot. And Thomas Irving knew someone was dying before he even spurred his horse toward Willow Creek. It was January of 1878, and the bitter cold had turned every stream and river into a death trap covered with deceptively thin ice. He had been riding the boundary of his ranch when he heard it, that unmistakable sound followed by a scream that cut through the howling wind. Thomas urged his mare into a gallop, his breath coming out in white clouds as he raced toward the creek that wound through the valley between his property and the road to Butte. Through the bare cottonwoods, he could see a dark figure thrashing in the water, the ice around them breaking into larger and larger pieces with each desperate movement. Without thinking, Thomas threw himself from his horse and ran toward the bank, his boots sliding on the frozen ground. The woman in the water was already weakening, her movements becoming slower as the cold sapped her strength. Her heavy winter coat was pulling her down, and her face had gone pale as death itself. Thomas did not hesitate. He grabbed a fallen branch and lay flat on his stomach, distributing his weight as he crawled across the ice toward her. The surface groaned beneath him, and he could feel it bending, but he kept moving forward. "Grab the branch," he shouted over the wind. "Do not try to pull yourself up, just hold on." Her eyes met his, brown and terrified and already glazing over with cold. She reached for the branch with fingers that barely seemed to work anymore, and when she finally grasped it, Thomas began pulling backward with all his strength. The ice cracked beneath him, spider web fractures spreading outward, but he did not stop. Inch by inch, he dragged her toward solid ground, his muscles screaming with the effort. When they finally reached the bank, Thomas hauled her onto the frozen mud and immediately began stripping off her wet coat. She was shaking so violently that her teeth were chattering too hard for her to speak, and her lips had turned blue. He wrapped her in his own thick sheepskin coat and lifted her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, or perhaps the adrenaline made her seem lighter. "My horse," she managed to gasp out through her shaking. "My horse ran off." "Forget the horse," Thomas said, carrying her to where his mare waited. "You will die if we do not get you warm right now." His ranch house was 3 miles away, but he knew he could not make it that far. There was an old line shack less than a mile to the east, a small cabin that cowboys used during the summer when they were working the far pastures. Thomas mounted his horse with the woman cradled against his chest and kicked the mare into motion. The woman had stopped shaking, which was worse than the trembling. Her body was shutting down, giving up the fight against the cold. "Stay with me," Thomas said, holding her tighter. "What is your name?" "Molly," she whispered. "Molly Patterson." "Well, Molly Patterson, my name is Thomas Irving, and you are not going to die today. Do you hear me? You are going to stay awake and keep talking to me." "So cold," she murmured, her eyes drifting closed. "I know you are cold. Tell me what you were doing out here. Where were you going?" "But," she said, her words slurring. "Stage from Bozeman. Stopped to water the horses. I wanted to stretch my legs. Thought the ice would hold." Thomas cursed under his breath. The stage driver should have known better than to let passengers wander near the creek in this weather. He would have words with whoever had been so careless, but that would have to wait. Right now, all that mattered was getting Molly warm. The line shack appeared through the swirling snow, a dark shape against the white landscape. Thomas dismounted and kicked the door open, carrying Molly inside. The cabin was barely larger than a horse stall, with a small iron stove, a narrow cot, and a few shelves holding supplies. Thomas laid Molly on the cot and immediately set about building a fire in the stove. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, and soon flames were crackling, beginning to push back the deadly cold. "We need to get you out of these wet clothes," Thomas said, turning back to Molly. Her eyes were closed again, and he shook her shoulder gently. "Molly, wake up. You need to help me." Her eyelids fluttered open, but she seemed barely aware of where she was. Thomas knew he was running out of time. He had seen men die from the cold before, had watched hypothermia steal the life from bodies that seemed whole and undamaged. He began unlacing her boots, pulling off the soaked leather and then her stockings, which were frozen stiff. Her feet were white and waxy, the toes beginning to turn gray. Working quickly but carefully, Thomas removed her wet dress and undergarments, averting his eyes as much as possible and focusing only on the task at hand. He wrapped her in every blanket he could find in the cabin, then added his own shirt for good measure. The fire was roaring now, and he moved the cot closer to the stove, close enough that he could feel the heat radiating outward. Molly was still too cold, still unresponsive. Thomas knew what he had to do, even though the impropriety of it made his ears burn. In situations like this, body heat was the only thing that might save her life. He stripped down to his undershirt and long underwear and climbed onto the narrow cot beside her, wrapping his arms around her and pulling her against his chest. He could feel how cold she was, how her skin felt like touching marble. "Come on, Molly," he said softly, rubbing her arms and back, trying to generate friction and warmth. "Come back, fight this." For what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, Thomas held her, willing his own body heat to transfer to her, praying to a God he was not sure he still believed in. Gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, he felt her skin begin to warm. The deathly chill started to fade, replaced by something closer to normal human warmth. Then, finally, she began to shiver again, her body's natural defenses returning to life. "That is it," Thomas encouraged, relief flooding through him. "That is good. Shivering is good." Molly's eyes opened, more focused now, and she looked up at him in confusion. "Where am I? A line shack on my property. You fell through the ice. Do you remember?" Memory flooded back into her eyes, along with fear and then embarrassment as she realized her state of undress and how close they were lying together. "Oh God, I am so sorry. I am mortified." "Do not be," Thomas said, though he carefully extracted himself from the cot and stood up, putting a respectful distance between them. "Your life was in danger. There was no other choice." He turned away while she composed herself, feeding more wood into the stove and melting snow in a small pot for water. When he glanced back, Molly had wrapped the blankets more securely around herself and was sitting up on the cot, looking more alive than she had any right to after what she had been through. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You saved my life. Anyone would have done the same." "No," Molly said firmly, her voice stronger now. "Most men would have worried about propriety or their reputation. You acted without hesitation. I am alive because of you." Thomas poured the heated water into a tin cup and brought it to her. "Drink this slowly. It will help warm you from the inside." Molly wrapped her hands around the cup, and he noticed how delicate her fingers were, though there was a strength in her grip. She took a small sip and then looked at him directly, and for the first time, Thomas really saw her. She was younger than he had first thought, probably in her early 20s, with chestnut brown hair that was beginning to dry in waves around her face. Her eyes were the color of strong coffee, and there was an intelligence in them that spoke of education and experience beyond her years. "I suppose proper introductions are in order, given the circumstances," Molly said, and there was a hint of humor in her voice that surprised him. "Molly Patterson, formerly of Philadelphia, currently between destinations." "Thomas Irving," he replied, finding himself smiling despite everything. "Rancher, Montana born and raised, currently playing nursemaid." "A role you perform admirably," Molly said. She took another sip of water and then asked, "How long before it is safe to move?" "I was meant to be in but 2 hours ago. My cousin will be worried sick." "We should stay here until morning at least. The temperature is still dropping, and you need to regain your strength. I will ride to my ranch once I am certain you are stable and send one of my men to Butt with a message." "I cannot ask you to do that." "You are not asking. I am telling you what is going to happen." Thomas's voice was gentle but firm. "You nearly died today, Miss Patterson. Another few minutes in that water and I would have been pulling out a corpse instead of a living woman. You will rest, and you will recover, and you will not argue with me about it." Molly studied him for a long moment, and Thomas found himself wanting to know what she was thinking. Finally, she nodded. "Very well, Mr. Irving. I will defer to your expertise in matters of freezing creeks and rescue operations. Call me Thomas. I think we are past formalities, all things considered. Then you must call me Molly." She paused, looking down at her cup. "I truly am grateful, and I promise I am not usually so careless. I grew up in Pennsylvania, and I have walked across frozen ponds dozens of times. I thought I knew how to judge ice." "Montana ice is different," Thomas said, sitting down on a wooden crate that served as the cabin's only chair. "The temperature swings here are more extreme. Ice that looks solid in the morning can be treacherous by afternoon. And the creeks have currents that keep parts of them from freezing properly, even when it looks like solid ice. A lesson I will not soon forget." Molly pulled the blankets more tightly around herself. "What brought you to that particular spot at that particular time?" "It seems like remarkable good fortune. I was checking the boundary fences. We have had problems with cattle wandering off, and I wanted to make sure there were no breaks in the line." Thomas stoked the fire again, watching the flames dance. "I heard the ice crack. That sound carries in cold air like this." "Providence, then," Molly said softly. "I do not know what I believe about God or fate, but I am grateful for whatever force sent you to that place today." They fell into a comfortable silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the wind howling outside. Thomas found himself studying Molly when she was not looking, curious about this woman who could nearly die and then joke about propriety minutes later. She had courage, that much was certain, and there was something about the way she carried herself, even wrapped in blankets and recovering from hypothermia, that spoke of dignity and strength. "You said you were between destinations," Thomas said after a while. "What brings you to Montana?" Molly's expression became more guarded. "I am going to live with my cousin in Butt. Her husband owns a mercantile there. She wrote to me last year, offering me a position helping in the store." "You came all the way from Philadelphia to work in a store." "I came all the way from Philadelphia to start over," Molly said, and there was steel in her voice now. "Sometimes a person needs a new beginning, away from old expectations and old mistakes." Thomas recognized the tone of someone who did not want to be pressed for details, so he let the subject drop. Everyone in the West had a story, a reason for being here, and most of those stories involved running from something or someone. He had learned not to pry too deeply into other people's pasts. "Well," he said, "Montana is certainly the place for new beginnings. The territory is barely 20 years old, and Butt is growing faster than anyone expected. The silver mines are bringing in people from all over." "Have you always been a rancher?" "My father was a rancher, and his father before him, after a fashion. My grandfather came out here in the late 40s, when Montana was still wild country. He trapped beaver for a few years, then started running cattle when the fur trade dried up. My father expanded the operation, and now I am trying to keep it all together. That must be difficult, managing a ranch alone. I have help, a few good men who know cattle and know this land, but yes, it is hard work, especially in winter." Thomas stood up and checked Molly's clothes, which were drying near the stove. The dress was still damp, but her undergarments were almost dry. He handed them to her, turning his back. "You should try to get dressed. You will feel more yourself." When Molly had dressed in her somewhat dry clothes, Thomas offered her some jerky and hardtack from the supplies kept in the cabin. It was not much of a meal, but it was better than nothing. They ate in companionable silence, and Thomas noticed that Molly's color had returned fully. Her cheeks were pink now, and the terrifying waxy pallor was gone completely. "I should ride to the ranch now, while there is still some daylight," Thomas said. "It is about 3 miles from here. I will send someone to Butte with a message for your cousin, and I will bring back supplies and a wagon to take you somewhere more comfortable." "Will you be all right, riding alone in this cold?" The question surprised Thomas. Most women in her situation would be focused on their own comfort, not concerned about his welfare. "I have ridden in worse, and I will be back before full dark. Keep the fire going and do not go outside for any reason. Do you know how to use a rifle?" "My father taught me to shoot when I was 12. Thomas took down the Winchester that hung above the door and checked that it was loaded. "Just in case. We have had some trouble with wolves this winter." Molly took the rifle with comfortable familiarity, and Thomas felt his respect for her increase another notch. This was not some delicate city flower who would faint at the first sign of danger. She was stronger than she looked. "I will be back soon," he said. And then he was out the door and mounting his horse, riding hard toward his ranch house. The Irving ranch house was a solid 2-story structure built from logs and stone, much larger and more comfortable than the line shack. Thomas had built it himself 5 years ago, after his father died and left him the ranch. It had been meant for a family, for a wife and children, but those plans had never materialized. There had been a woman once, Sarah, but she had decided that life as a rancher's wife was not for her and had gone back east 3 years ago. Thomas had been alone since then, except for his hired hands. He burst into the house and found his foreman, Jack Weatherby, sitting at the kitchen table mending a bridle. Jack was in his 50s, weathered and tough as old leather, and had been working for the Irving family since Thomas was a boy. "Need you to ride to Butte," Thomas said without preamble. "There is a woman, Molly Patterson, who was supposed to arrive this afternoon. Her cousin will be worried. Tell them she is safe and will arrive tomorrow." Jack's eyebrows rose. "A woman? What happened?" Thomas quickly explained the situation while he gathered supplies, blankets, food, and a change of clothes from his own wardrobe that Molly could use temporarily. Jack listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally. "You did right," Jack said when Thomas finished. "Want me to bring the wagon out to the line shack?" "No, I will do it. You focus on getting to Butte before full dark. The cousin's husband owns a mercantile name of Patterson. Patterson's Mercantile on Granite Street. I know the place." Jack stood up and reached for his coat. "I will head out now." Thomas hitched up the wagon himself, loading it with the supplies and blankets. He also included a dress that had belonged to his mother, carefully preserved in a trunk. It would be too large for Molly, probably, but it would be better than the wet, half-frozen dress she had been wearing. The ride back to the line shack took longer with the wagon, and the sun was setting by the time Thomas arrived. He could see smoke coming from the chimney, which meant Molly had kept the fire going as instructed. He knocked on the door before entering, giving her warning. Molly was standing by the stove, still wrapped in blankets, and she turned with visible relief when Thomas entered. "I was beginning to worry that something had happened to you. Just took longer to hitch the wagon." Thomas began unloading supplies. "I sent my foreman to Butte to let your cousin know you are safe." I thought we could stay here tonight, let you rest fully, and then I will take you to my ranch house in the morning. From there, we can arrange proper transportation to Butt. I do not want to impose. You are not imposing. You are accepting help that you need. Thomas held up the dress. This was my mother's. It will probably be too big, but it is dry and clean. Molly took the dress with something like wonder in her eyes. Your mother's? I could not possibly. My mother died 10 years ago. She would have wanted it to be used, not sitting in a trunk gathering dust. Please. Thank you, Molly said softly, for everything. You have been so kind. Thomas busied himself with setting up a proper camp in the small cabin. He spread blankets on the floor for himself, insisting that Molly take the cot. He unpacked the food he had brought: bread, cheese, dried apples, and a flask of whiskey for warmth. It was a far better meal than the jerky and hardtack. As they ate, they talked more easily than they had before. Molly told him about Philadelphia, about growing up in a city where the buildings were so tall they blocked out the sun, where you could walk for miles and never see a tree or a wild animal. Thomas told her about Montana, about watching thunderstorms roll across the plains, about the first time he had seen a grizzly bear, about winters so cold that your breath would freeze in your beard. You ever wish you could leave? Molly asked. Go see the cities and the ocean and all the things that are out there. Sometimes, Thomas admitted, but this land gets into your blood. I tried going east once when I was younger, made it as far as Chicago before I felt like I could not breathe. Too many people, too much noise, too many buildings. I was back in Montana within a month. I think I might understand that now, Molly said, looking toward the small window where stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. There is something about this place. It is harsh and dangerous and unforgiving, but it is also beautiful in a way that makes your heart ache. They talked late into the night, and Thomas found himself sharing things he had not spoken about in years. He told her about his mother's death from pneumonia, about his father's slow decline after that, about the loneliness of running a ranch with no family to share it with. Molly, in turn, opened up more about why she had left Philadelphia. I was engaged, she said quietly, staring into her cup. To a man my parents approved of, a lawyer with good prospects. Charles was his name. Everything was planned: the wedding, the house we would live in, the parties we would attend. My whole life was mapped out and I had no say in any of it. What happened? I realized that I would rather die than spend the rest of my life pretending to be happy in a marriage where I was nothing more than an ornament. So I broke the engagement, which scandalized everyone. My parents were furious. Society turned its back on me. I became someone to be pitied or gossiped about. Molly's voice was steady, but Thomas could hear the pain underneath. My cousin's letter offering me a place in Butt came at exactly the right time. It felt like an escape route. You were brave to leave. Or cowardly, depending on how you look at it. I ran away rather than face the consequences. No, Thomas said firmly. Staying in a life that would have made you miserable would have been the cowardly choice. You chose the unknown over unhappiness. That takes courage. Molly looked at him, and in the firelight her eyes seemed to shimmer. You are a kind man, Thomas Irving. Your Sarah was a fool to leave you. Thomas felt his chest tighten. He had not mentioned Sarah by name, which meant Molly was intuitive enough to have understood what he had not said. Perhaps she was wise. This life is not for everyone. Perhaps she did not deserve you. The words hung in the air between them, and Thomas felt something shift, some invisible line being crossed. He was intensely aware of Molly, of the way the firelight played across her features, of the intelligence and strength in her eyes. He had known her for less than a day, had met her under the most unusual circumstances, and yet he felt drawn to her in a way he had not felt drawn to anyone in years. "We should sleep," he said, breaking the moment. "Tomorrow will be a long day." Molly nodded and settled onto the cot while Thomas lay down on his blankets by the fire. He expected to lie awake for hours, his mind too full of thoughts and feelings to rest, but exhaustion claimed him quickly. He woke once in the night to find that the fire had burned low. As he fed more wood into the stove, he glanced at Molly and found her awake, watching him. "Could not sleep?" he asked softly. "I keep thinking about how close I came to dying today." If you had not heard the ice crack, if you had been checking a different section of fence, if you had been even a few minutes later. She trailed off, shaking her head. Thomas moved to sit on the edge of the cot. "But I was there. You did not die, you are safe." "Why does that feel like it means something more than just coincidence?" "I do not know," Thomas said honestly. "But I am glad I was there. I am glad you are alive." Molly reached out and took his hand, and the simple touch sent warmth spreading through Thomas's chest. They sat like that for a long moment, not speaking, just holding hands in the darkness of the cabin with the fire crackling softly beside them. "I should let you sleep," Thomas finally said, though he did not want to let go of her hand. "Stay," Molly said. "Just for a moment longer. I do not want to be alone right now." So Thomas stayed, sitting beside her on the narrow cot, holding her hand while she drifted back to sleep. When her breathing had evened out and he was certain she was deeply asleep, he carefully extracted his hand and returned to his own blankets. But he could still feel the warmth of her touch, could still see the trust in her eyes when she had asked him to stay. Morning came too quickly, announced by pale light filtering through the small window. Thomas woke to find that Molly was already up, had stoked the fire, and was attempting to make coffee with the supplies he had brought. "Let me," he said, taking over the task. "Coffee is a science, and I have had many years to perfect it." "Is that your polite way of saying I am doing it wrong?" "No. It is my polite way of saying that if you drink what you are making, you will be awake for 3 days straight and possibly develop the ability to see through walls." Molly laughed, a genuine sound of delight that made Thomas smile. "Very well, I will defer to your expertise." They ate a simple breakfast of bread and cheese, and then Thomas helped Molly into the wagon. Her dress from yesterday was mostly dry now, but she had changed into his mother's dress, which indeed swam on her smaller frame but looked somehow right anyway. She had pinned her hair up as best she could without proper supplies, and there was color in her cheeks and life in her eyes. The ride to the ranch house took about an hour, the wagon bouncing along the rough trail. Molly looked around with obvious interest, taking in the vast expanse of land, the distant mountains white with snow, the cattle clustered near the windbreaks. "How much land do you have?" she asked. "About 2,000 acres, give or take." "It is not the biggest ranch in Montana, but it is enough to run a decent herd. It must be wonderful, owning all this land, being your own master." "It has its advantages and its challenges, but yes, I would not trade it for anything." When the ranch house came into view, Molly let out a small gasp. "Thomas, it is beautiful, like something from a picture book." Thomas felt a swell of pride. He had put his heart into building this house, had imagined it filled with family and warmth. "Thank you. I built it myself, with help from Jack and some of the other men." He helped Molly down from the wagon and led her inside. The house was clean but obviously lacked a woman's touch. It was practical and sturdy but not particularly homey. Still, it was warm and comfortable, with a large fireplace in the main room and a kitchen that had been his mother's design. "I will have one of the men ride to Butte this afternoon and arrange for proper transportation for you," Thomas said, showing Molly to the guest room. "You can rest here as long as you need." "Thank you," Molly said, but there was something uncertain in her expression, as if she was not sure she wanted to leave. Thomas left her to rest and went to attend to the work that had piled up in his absence. There were cattle to check on, feed to distribute, repairs that needed to be made. He threw himself into the work, trying not to think about the woman in his house, trying not to acknowledge the hollow feeling that came when he thought about her leaving. Jack returned from but around noon, reporting that Molly's cousin had been relieved to hear she was safe and would expect her the following day. Thomas thanked him and then found himself putting off making the arrangements for transportation. He told himself it was because Molly needed more time to recover, but he knew that was not the whole truth. That evening, he and Molly ate dinner together in the big kitchen. Thomas had cooked a simple meal of beef stew and biscuits, and Molly had insisted on helping despite his protests. "You have done so much for me already," she said as she set the table. "Let me do something useful." As they ate, they fell back into the easy conversation they had discovered the night before. Molly told him about books she had read, plays she had seen in Philadelphia, ideas and thoughts that made Thomas realize how hungry he had been for intellectual companionship. Most of the people he interacted with were good men, but not particularly interested in discussing literature or philosophy. "Have you read much Mark Twain?" Molly asked. "I brought several of his books with me. They are in my trunk, which I assume is still on the stage or in Butt. I have read some of his work. Roughing It made me laugh until I cried." His descriptions of the West are exaggerated, but there is truth underneath the humor. "I would love to hear what you think is accurate and what is not. Perhaps when I retrieve my trunk, I could lend you some books." "I would like that," Thomas said, and realized he meant it deeply. The thought of having a reason to see Molly again, of having conversations like this one, made his heart lift. After dinner, they sat by the fireplace, and Thomas found himself telling Molly about his dreams for the ranch, about wanting to improve the bloodlines of his cattle, about possibly expanding into horse breeding. She listened with genuine interest, asking intelligent questions, offering thoughts that showed she was not just being polite but was truly engaged. "You love this place," Molly observed. "Not just the land but the work itself. I can hear it in your voice." "I suppose I do." "It is hard and often frustrating, but there is something deeply satisfying about building something with your own hands, about being part of this land." "I envy you that," Molly said softly. "Knowing your place in the world, knowing what you are meant to do, I have never had that certainty." "Perhaps you will find it here. Montana has a way of showing people who they really are." Molly looked at him, and something passed between them, an understanding that went deeper than words. Thomas felt his pulse quicken, felt the air in the room become charged with possibility. "Molly," he began, not sure what he wanted to say but knowing he needed to say something. "I should go to bed," Molly said quickly, standing up. "It has been a long day and I am still recovering." Thomas stood as well, disappointed but understanding. "Of course, sleep well." But at the doorway to the hall, Molly paused and turned back. "Thomas, I want you to know that these past 2 days have been the strangest and somehow the best days I have had in a very long time. Thank you for that." Then she was gone, leaving Thomas standing by the fire, his heart pounding and his mind racing. He stayed up long after she had gone to bed, staring into the flames and trying to understand what was happening to him. He barely knew this woman, had only just met her under the most unlikely circumstances, and yet he felt more alive than he had in years. The next morning, Thomas could delay no longer. He hitched up the wagon again and prepared to take Molly to Butt. She appeared dressed in her own clothes, which were now fully dry and brushed clean, though they showed the wear of her ordeal. Her hair was properly pinned, and she had regained all her natural poise and grace. "Ready?" Thomas asked, though he wanted to say anything but that. "As I will ever be," Molly replied, and he thought he heard reluctance in her voice too. The ride to Butte took most of the morning. The town was growing rapidly thanks to the silver mines, and even in winter it bustled with activity. Thomas drove the wagon down Granite Street until they reached Patterson's Mercantile, a well-maintained store with large windows displaying goods from back east. A woman rushed out before they had even fully stopped, a plump, pretty woman in her 30s with Molly's brown eyes. "Molly. Oh, thank God you are safe. When we got word about what happened, I was beside myself with worry." Molly climbed down from the wagon and embraced her cousin. "I am fine, Catherine, thanks to Mr. Irving here." Catherine turned to Thomas with tears in her eyes. "Mr. Irving, my husband and I are forever in your debt. If there is anything we can ever do for you, anything at all, you have only to ask." "No debt," Thomas said, feeling uncomfortable with the effusive gratitude. "I did what anyone would do." "Not anyone," Catherine said firmly. "You are a hero, and we will not forget it." Thomas helped unload Molly's recovered trunk, which had indeed made it to Butte safely. As he set it down on the wooden sidewalk, he knew this was goodbye, knew that this would likely be the last time he saw Molly Patterson. The realization hit him like a physical blow. "Well," he said awkwardly, "I suppose this is farewell." Molly looked at him, and he saw his own reluctance mirrored in her eyes. "Thomas, I cannot thank you enough for everything. You saved my life and then treated me with such kindness and respect. I will never forget you." "Nor I you," Thomas said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. He wanted to say more, wanted to ask if he could call on her, wanted to tell her that he had not felt this way about anyone since Sarah, and that even those feelings paled in comparison to what he felt when he looked at her. But Catherine was standing right there, and there were people on the street watching, and the moment was not right. So Thomas simply tipped his hat, climbed back onto the wagon, and drove away. He did not look back, could not bear to see Molly standing there receding into the distance. He felt hollowed out, as if something vital had been taken from him. The days that followed were difficult ones for Thomas. He threw himself into his work with almost manic intensity, trying to exhaust himself so thoroughly that he would not have the energy to think about Molly. But every night, lying in his bed, he would remember the way she had looked in the firelight, the sound of her laugh, the warmth of her hand in his. Jack noticed his mood and commented on it one evening as they were doing the books in the ranch office. "You are thinking about that woman, aren't you? The one from the creek." "I do not know what you are talking about," Thomas said, not looking up from the ledger. "Like hell you do not. I have known you since you were knee-high to a grasshopper, boy. I know when something is eating at you." Thomas sighed and set down his pen. "What is the point, Jack? She has her own life now with her cousin in Butte. She came to Montana to start over, not to get entangled with some rancher she barely knows. So go see her, court her proper. What is stopping you? Pride, I suppose, fear of rejection." The memory of Sarah and how badly that ended. Sarah was a mistake from the start, and you know it. You wanted to be married, and she was there and pretty, and you convinced yourself it was love. But it was not really. This woman, though, this Molly, I see something different in your eyes when you talk about her. Thomas knew Jack was right. What he had felt for Sarah had been pale and insubstantial compared to the intensity of his feelings for Molly. But knowing that, and having the courage to act on it, were two different things. "What if she does not feel the same way?" Thomas asked quietly. "Then you will have your answer and can move on. But at least you will know, instead of spending the rest of your life wondering." That night, Thomas lay awake for hours, wrestling with his fear and his hope. By the time dawn broke, he had made his decision. He would go to Butt, would call on Molly properly, and would find out once and for all if what he felt was mutual. He dressed in his best clothes, which admittedly were not very fine but were clean and respectable. He rode into town mid-morning, his heart pounding harder the closer he got to Granite Street. When he reached the Mercantile, he tied his horse outside and took a deep breath before entering. The store was busy with customers, and Thomas had to wait while Catherine helped an older woman decide between different types of flour. Finally, she noticed him and came over with a welcoming smile. "Mr. Irving, what a pleasant surprise. What can I help you with today?" "I was hoping to speak with Molly if she is available." Catherine's smile grew wider and more knowing. "She is in the back, doing inventory. I will fetch her for you." Thomas waited, his palms sweating despite the cool temperature. When Molly appeared through the curtain that separated the store from the back room, his breath caught. She was wearing a simple blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes, and her hair was pinned up in a way that showed the graceful curve of her neck. "Thomas," she said, and he heard surprise and something else, something like joy in her voice. "I did not expect to see you. I apologize for calling unannounced. I wanted to see how you were doing to make sure you had recovered fully from your ordeal." "I am well, completely recovered. In fact, I have been helping Catherine in the store, and I am finding that I quite enjoy the work." They stood there awkwardly for a moment, both aware of Catherine watching them with poorly concealed interest. Finally, Molly said, "Would you like to take a walk? I am due for a break, and it is a pleasant day." "I would like that very much." They walked down Granite Street together, heading toward the outskirts of town where there were fewer people and more privacy. For a while neither spoke, the silence between them filled with unspoken questions and possibilities. "I am glad you came," Molly finally said. "I have been thinking about you constantly since we parted." Thomas's heart leaped. "As I have been thinking of you." "Molly, I know we have only just met and under the strangest circumstances, but I cannot deny what I feel. These past weeks without seeing you have been difficult." "For me as well," Molly admitted. "Catherine has been teasing me about being distracted. She says I am always staring out the window as if I am waiting for someone." "Were you waiting for someone?" Molly stopped walking and turned to face him. "I was waiting for you, though I told myself I was being foolish. I thought perhaps what I felt was just gratitude, just the natural attachment to someone who saved your life. But it is more than that, is it not?" "It is so much more than that," Thomas said, taking her hands in his. "Molly, I know this is fast, perhaps too fast, but I have never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. You are brave and intelligent and strong, and you make me want to be a better man. I would like to court you properly if you will allow it." "Yes," Molly said, her eyes shining. "Yes, I would like that very much." Thomas felt as if a weight had been lifted from his chest. "Then may I call on you again? Perhaps take you to dinner. You may call on me as often as you like, and I would love to have dinner with you." They walked back to the Mercantile hand in hand, making plans for Thomas to return in 3 days' time. When they parted, Thomas felt as if he were floating. The ride back to the ranch seemed to take no time at all, and when he arrived, Jack took one look at his face and grinned. "So I take it things went well." "Better than well," Thomas said, unable to stop smiling. She said yes. "About damn time," Jack said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Now maybe you will stop moping around here like a lost calf." Over the following weeks, Thomas courted Molly with a dedication and romance that surprised even himself. He took her to dinner at the best restaurant Butt had to offer, brought her flowers that he had to send away for because nothing was blooming in the Montana winter, and spent every moment he could spare with her. They talked about everything: their hopes and dreams, their fears and failures, their beliefs about life and love, and what made a life meaningful. Thomas learned that Molly had studied literature in school and had dreamed of being a teacher before her parents had pushed her toward marriage. Molly learned about Thomas's childhood on the ranch, about his complicated relationship with his father, about his deep love for the land that had shaped him. They also spent time simply being together, comfortable in silence, finding that they did not always need words to communicate. Thomas taught Molly to ride properly, giving her one of his gentler mares. Molly introduced Thomas to poetry, reading to him from books she loved while he listened with his eyes closed, absorbing not just the words but the sound of her voice. Catherine and her husband, Robert, approved wholeheartedly of the match, and soon Thomas was a regular presence at their dinner table. He liked the Pattersons, found them to be good people with warm hearts and practical minds. "She has never been this happy," Catherine confided to Thomas one evening when Molly was helping Robert in the store. "When she first arrived, she was so wounded, so uncertain of herself. You have brought her back to life." "She has done the same for me," Thomas replied honestly. "I did not realize how much I had closed myself off until I met her." Spring came early that year, the snow melting in March and the first wildflowers appearing by April. Thomas took Molly out to the ranch, wanting her to see his home in a season that showed it at its best. They rode across the greening plains, watching newborn calves run on unsteady legs, breathing in air that smelled of grass and earth and possibility. "It is beautiful," Molly said, looking out across the land with wonder. "I understand now why you love it so much." "It could be yours too," Thomas said, his heart pounding. "If you wanted it to be." Molly turned to look at him, and Thomas dismounted and helped her down from her horse. Then, there on the open prairie with the wind blowing around them and the sky stretching forever overhead, Thomas got down on one knee. "Molly Patterson, you came into my life like a miracle and you have changed everything. I love you more than I thought it was possible to love another person. Will you marry me? Will you share this life with me, this land and this home and whatever the future brings?" Molly was crying, but her smile was radiant. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Thomas, I will marry you. I love you so much." Thomas stood and pulled her into his arms, kissing her with all the passion and tenderness he had been holding back for weeks. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Molly laughed with pure joy. "When?" she asked. "When can we marry?" "As soon as you want. Tomorrow, if you wish." "Let us say next month. I want Catherine to have time to help me prepare, and I want you to meet what family I have back east. I will write to them tonight." They married on a beautiful day in May, in the small church in Butte with Catherine and Robert standing up for them. To Thomas's surprise and Molly's delight, her parents made the journey from Philadelphia, her mother tearful and apologetic for the way they had treated her after she broke her engagement. "We were wrong," Molly's father said, shaking Thomas's hand. "We thought we knew what was best for our daughter, but we were only thinking of society and propriety, not her happiness. You clearly make her happy, and for that, we are grateful." The wedding was simple but beautiful, and when Thomas and Molly exchanged their vows, there was not a dry eye in the church. Molly was stunning in a dress of ivory silk that Catherine had helped her make, and Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion as he slipped the ring onto her finger. The celebration afterward was held at the Mercantile, which Robert had closed for the day. There was food and music and dancing, and Thomas waltzed with his new wife under paper lanterns while their friends and family celebrated around them. "Are you happy?" Thomas asked as they swayed together. "I am happier than I ever dreamed possible," Molly said, resting her head against his chest. "To think that if I had not fallen through that ice, if you had not been there, none of this would have happened." "Everything happens for a reason," Thomas said. "You were meant to fall through that creek, and I was meant to pull you out, And then you were meant to thaw your way straight into my soul." Molly looked up at him, her eyes swimming with tears. "That is beautiful and true. You saved me in more ways than one, Thomas Irving." "And you saved me right back, Molly Irving." They left the celebration early, riding out to the ranch house that was now their home together. Thomas carried Molly over the threshold, and she laughed and kissed him as he set her down in the main room. "It needs a woman's touch," Molly said, looking around. "Curtains and rugs and little touches that make a house a home. Then you shall have whatever you need to make it perfect. This is your home now, too." That night, they came together as husband and wife, and Thomas felt a completeness he had never known before. Holding Molly in his arms, feeling her heart beat against his, he understood what it meant to be truly alive, truly connected to another human being. The months that followed were some of the happiest of Thomas's life. Molly threw herself into making the ranch house a home, adding curtains she sewed herself, bringing in furniture from Butt, planting a garden near the house where she grew vegetables and flowers. She also took an active interest in the running of the ranch, learning about the cattle and the business side of the operation. Jack and the other ranch hands adored her, especially after she started cooking big meals for everyone on Sundays, treating the hired men like family. Thomas would watch her laughing with Jack or teaching one of the younger cowboys to read, and his heart would swell with love and pride. By fall, Molly had news that made Thomas nearly faint with joy. She was pregnant, due to give birth in early spring. Thomas immediately became protective and worried, but Molly laughed off his concerns. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time, Thomas. I am strong and healthy and everything will be fine. But what if something goes wrong? The nearest doctor is in Butt, and that is a 30-minute ride. Then we will make sure we have supplies here and someone who knows what to do. Catherine helped deliver 3 babies last year. She can be here when my time comes." Thomas had to be content with that, though he worried constantly. He made sure Molly did not overexert herself, sometimes to the point where she grew exasperated with his hovering. "I am pregnant, not made of glass," she told him one evening when he had insisted she sit down after she had been on her feet for all of 10 minutes. I know. I am sorry. I just want you and the baby to be safe." Molly's expression softened, and she took his hand and placed it on her swelling belly. "We are safe. We are more than safe. We are loved and protected and cared for. Our baby is lucky to have you as a father." Winter came again, and Thomas found himself remembering the previous winter, remembering the sound of ice cracking and the race to save Molly's life. It seemed like a lifetime ago, though it had been barely a year. So much had changed, so much had grown between them. On a cold night in January, almost exactly 1 year after he had pulled Molly from Willow Creek, Thomas and Molly stood outside the ranch house, looking up at the stars that blazed overhead. "1 year ago, I nearly died," Molly said softly. "And now look at us. Married, expecting a child, building a life together. It is miraculous." "You are miraculous," Thomas said, wrapping his arms around her from behind, his hands resting on her belly. "You came into my life frozen and half dead, and you brought warmth and light and love into places I did not even know were cold and dark." "We saved each other," Molly said, leaning back against him. "That is what love does. It saves us from loneliness, from despair, from living half a life. You showed me what real love looks like, what it means to be truly seen and valued for who you are." They stood there together under the vast Montana sky, and Thomas felt a peace and contentment he had never known before. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever hardships the future might bring, he knew they would face them together. Molly went into labor on a morning in late March when the prairie was just beginning to turn green. Thomas sent one of the ranch hands racing to Butt to fetch Catherine while he stayed with Molly, holding her hand and trying not to panic. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Thomas feared he would lose her, but Molly was strong, just as he had always known she was. When their son finally arrived, red-faced and screaming with impressive volume, Thomas wept openly. He held the tiny, perfect baby in his arms while Catherine tended to Molly, and he felt as if his heart might burst from the love that filled it. "He is beautiful," Molly said weakly from the bed, exhausted but radiant. "Let me see him." Thomas carefully placed their son in her arms, and Molly looked down at the baby with an expression of such pure love that Thomas had to look away for a moment to compose himself. "What should we name him?" Molly asked. They had discussed many names over the months, but suddenly Thomas knew exactly what their son should be called. "William, after my grandfather, the one who first came to this land. William Irving." "William," Molly repeated, testing the name. "Yes, that is perfect." William Irving, welcome to the world. The years that followed were full and rich. William grew into a sturdy, curious boy with his mother's brown eyes and his father's love for the land. 2 years after William was born, Molly gave birth to a daughter they named Eleanor, a delicate girl with a fierce spirit. 3 years after that came another son, James, who was quieter than his siblings but no less loved. The ranch prospered under Thomas and Molly's joint management. Thomas expanded the herd and improved the bloodlines just as he had dreamed, while Molly handled the business side with a sharp mind that impressed everyone who dealt with her. They became known throughout Montana as a couple who worked together in true partnership, respecting and supporting each other. Molly never forgot where she had come from or how she had nearly died. Every year on the anniversary of her fall through the ice, she and Thomas would ride out to Willow Creek together. They would stand by the water, remembering that terrifying day and giving thanks for the miracle that had brought them together. "I still have nightmares sometimes," Molly confessed one year as they stood by the creek, watching the water flow past. "I dream that I am falling through the ice again, but when I reach for the branch, no one is there." "But I was there," Thomas said, pulling her close. "And I will always be there. For the rest of our lives, Molly, I will always be there to pull you to safety." "I know," Molly said, kissing him softly. "Just as I will always be here to warm your heart and fill your life with love." As they aged together, their love deepened rather than fading. Thomas's hair turned gray at the temples, and Molly developed laugh lines around her eyes, but they still looked at each other with the same wonder and passion they had felt in those early days. They built a life rich in meaning and connection, filled with children and grandchildren, with hard work and simple pleasures, with love that had started in the most unlikely way and grown into something that sustained them both. Jack lived to a ripe old age and spent his final years bouncing the Irving grandchildren on his knee, telling them stories about their parents' romance that always made Thomas blush and Molly laugh. When he passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, Thomas and Molly mourned him as family, because that was what he had been. Catherine and Robert remained close friends, and their children grew up alongside the Irving children, all of them part of the tight-knit community that Butt had become. The town continued to grow and prosper, and the Irving Ranch remained a cornerstone of the local economy. Thomas and Molly never took their happiness for granted. They had both known loneliness and despair, had both experienced the emptiness of living a life that was not truly theirs. The life they built together was consciously chosen, deliberately nurtured, and deeply cherished. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Thomas took Molly back to the line shack where they had spent that first night together. It was no longer used for cowboys, having been replaced by a more modern structure closer to the current boundary of the ranch. But Thomas had maintained it over the years, keeping it as a kind of shrine to where their relationship had truly begun. "You remember?" Thomas asked as they stepped inside. The cot was still there, as was the old iron stove, though everything was clean and in good repair. "How could I forget?" Molly said, running her hand over the rough wood of the wall. "I was so cold, so frightened, so certain I was going to die, and then you held me and I knew I was going to be all right." "I knew that night," Thomas said. "I knew that you were going to change my life. I tried to tell myself I was being foolish, that it was just the unusual circumstances creating false feelings. But my heart knew the truth." "As did mine," Molly said, moving into his arms. "I fell in love with you while I was still half frozen, Thomas Irving. Every word you spoke, every gentle touch, every moment of care and respect, I fell deeper and deeper in love." They made love in that old line shack as the sun set outside, rediscovering each other with the familiarity and passion of 25 years together. Afterward, they lay wrapped in blankets, just as they had on that first night, and talked about their life together. "If you could go back," Thomas asked, "would you change anything? Would you be more careful around that creek, avoid falling through in the first place?" "Not for a moment," Molly said firmly. "Yes, it was terrifying, and yes, I could have died. But that moment brought me to you. It brought me to this life, these children, this love. I would fall through that ice 1,000 times if it meant having what we have together." "I love you," Thomas said, the words as true now as they had been the first time he said them. "I will love you until my last breath and beyond." "And I love you," Molly replied. "You pulled me from that frozen creek, Thomas, but you gave me so much more than just my life. You gave me a home, a family, a purpose. You gave me the freedom to be myself and the love to help me flourish. You gave me everything." As they rode back to the ranch house in the fading light, their hands clasped together, Thomas felt a profound gratitude for the twists of fate that had brought them together. Life was unpredictable and sometimes cruel, but it could also be extraordinarily generous, offering gifts beyond measure to those brave enough to accept them. The Irving Ranch continued to thrive for another generation. William took over management of the operation when Thomas decided to step back, proving himself to be a capable rancher with his father's integrity and his mother's business acumen. Alina married a schoolteacher and opened the first proper school in the area, ensuring that the children of ranchers and miners alike received a good education. James became a veterinarian, studying in Chicago before returning to Montana to care for the animals that were so crucial to the region's economy. Thomas and Molly grew old together with grace and gratitude. They spent their final years in the ranch house they had made into a home, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, all of them proof of the love that had started on a frozen January day by Willow Creek. On a spring morning when Thomas was 72 and Molly was 70, they took their regular walk around the property. The wildflowers were blooming, and the air was sweet with the smell of new grass. They moved more slowly than they once had, but they still walked hand in hand, still found joy in each other's company. "It has been a good life, has it not?" Molly said as they paused to rest on a bench Thomas had built years ago. "The best life," Thomas agreed. "Better than I ever dreamed possible. No regrets, not a single one. Well, perhaps I regret not kissing you sooner, not telling you I loved you sooner. I wasted precious time being afraid." "We found our way to each other," Molly said, resting her head on his shoulder. "That is what matters. And we have had decades together, decades of love and partnership and joy. That is more than most people ever get." Thomas wrapped his arm around his wife, this remarkable woman who had thawed her way straight into his soul all those years ago. He thought about that terrified moment when he had first seen her in the water, about the race against time to save her life, about all the moments since then that had woven their lives together into something beautiful and enduring. "I would do it all again," he said softly. "Every moment, every challenge, every joy and sorrow, I would choose you every single time." "And I would choose you," Molly replied. "In this life and any other, I would always choose you." They sat together on that bench for a long time, watching the sun move across the sky, feeling the warmth on their faces and the comfort of each other's presence. They had built something rare and precious together, a love that had started in the most dramatic fashion and had settled into something deep and sustaining. They had raised good children, had contributed to their community, had lived with integrity and compassion. When Thomas Irving finally passed away at the age of 78, he died peacefully in his sleep with Molly beside him. His last thoughts were of gratitude for the sound of cracking ice that had led him to Willow Creek, for the courage to pull a drowning woman from the freezing water, for every precious moment since then. Molly mourned him deeply, but not hopelessly, knowing that she had been blessed beyond measure to have shared her life with such a man. Molly lived another 5 years, spending them surrounded by family and working on the memoir she had always intended to write. She titled it Thawed by Love, a Montana romance, and it told the story of her journey from Philadelphia socialite to Montana rancher's wife, from a woman trapped by expectations to a woman freed by love. The book became a local treasure, passed down through generations of Montana families. When Molly's time came, she faced death as she had faced all the challenges in her life with courage and grace. Her last words, spoken to William who sat by her bedside, were about Thomas. "Tell your children," she whispered, "that true love exists. Tell them that it is worth waiting for, worth fighting for, worth risking everything for. Your father pulled me from that frozen creek, but what he really did was save my soul. And I saved his right back. That is what love does. It saves us." Molly Patterson Irving was buried beside her husband on a hill overlooking the ranch, under a sky as vast and blue as the first day she had seen Montana. On their shared headstone, their children had inscribed a simple message: "He pulled her from the frozen creek. She thawed her way straight into his soul." Together, they built a love that will never die. And in the years and decades that followed, the story of Thomas and Molly Irving became a legend in Montana, told and retold by generations who found hope and inspiration in the tale of two people who found each other against all odds. Parents told it to their children, and those children grew up believing in the power of love, in the possibility of second chances, in the miraculous way that life could take a moment of near tragedy and transform it into the beginning of something beautiful. The Irving Ranch continued to operate for another 100 years, passed down through the family, each generation adding to the legacy that Thomas and Molly had begun. The lined shack where they had spent that first night together was eventually preserved as a historical site, a reminder of how love can bloom in the most unlikely places. And if you were to visit that spot by Willow Creek where Molly fell through the ice all those years ago, you would find a small marker placed there by the Irving family. It reads simply, "Here, on a frozen January day in 1878, two lives came together and changed the course of history. May we all be so fortunate to find the love that saves us." The story of Thomas and Molly Irving reminds us that sometimes the most terrifying moments in our lives can lead to the greatest blessings. That love can appear when we least expect it, in forms we never anticipated. That courage and compassion can forge bonds stronger than any hardship. That two people, brought together by chance and fate, can build a legacy that outlasts their own lives and touches countless others. From a frozen creek to a thriving ranch, from a desperate rescue to a lifetime of partnership, from a moment of crisis to decades of joy, this was the story of Thomas and Molly Irving. And it was a love story for the ages, proving that in the wild and unforgiving landscape of the American West, the human heart was capable of creating warmth and beauty that could withstand any storm, outlast any winter, and burn bright for generations to come. Their love had been tested by ice and fire, by hardship and loss, by all the challenges that life could throw at them, and it had emerged stronger, deeper, and more beautiful with each passing year. It was a love that had saved them both, had given them purpose and meaning, had filled their lives with richness beyond measure. And that, in the end, was all that anyone could hope for, to love and be loved in return, completely, deeply, and forever.